All right. Hi, everyone. It's 12 o'clock, and so I want to respect everyone's time and give you all as much time as possible with our guest speaker today. My name is Michelle James, and I am the Director of Alumni Engagement here at the Rollins School of Public Health. So for those of you I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, it's great to meet you. Thanks for being here today. We are honored and privileged to have with us today one of our most distinguished alumni. And I say that because tonight we will bestow upon him our Rollins School of Public Health Distinguished Achievement Alumni Award. So if you're, that's right, thank you. So he has earned it and then some. But if you're around this evening around 6:30, pop on up to the 8th floor of the R. Randall Rollins building and join us to see us talk a little bit more about David and all of his amazing accomplishments. Just a brief introduction, and then I want to hand it over to David so he can share some great knowledge with you today. David is the chair of the accelerator at Loomis Council and a distinguished fellow with the Stimson Center. He is also a non-resident distinguished fellow with the Business Executives for National Security and principal at Lead Do Apt Ventures. As principal, Dr. Bray's passions include providing board level and CEO level leadership to different under the radar tech and data ventures, seeking to get started in novel situations to include activities that shape the future of data, bio, and space. He provides strategic direction, advice, and leadership to organizations confronting turbulent environments on multiple topics ranging from quantum computing to commercial space endeavors, synthetic biology to data cooperatives paired with AI. And I know for a fact he does way more than that. Those are just the highlights of what he does in his day. And so with that, I just want to thank you for being here, for sharing your time and your knowledge with us. I'm going to let you take it away. Please feel free to ask questions. He's an excellent resource for you all, so don't be shy.
Thank you, Michelle. If at any time you have questions, please raise your hand, chime in. I get as much value out of this as you do. Let's make it lively. Let's make it interactive. And I also, again, want to thank, Rollins School of Public Health, because about 20 years ago, actually it was literally 20 years ago, I was graduating with an RSPH, and so it's great to be back again. The conversation we're going to have today is that we need to be more people-centered and community-centered in our approaches to data. And in particular, if there's one thing I leave you with today, is we need to unlearn the lessons of the last decade that we have learned with data. Now, first step, though, is recognizing that AI right now is all the rage, even though artificial intelligence has been around since the late 1950s and gone through different methodologies. I think it's worth asking, especially in public health, what do we mean when we ask someone to trust what we're doing with data or data plus AI? And the research has shown that humans are willing to trust an entity if first they perceive benevolence, second they perceive competence, and third they perceive integrity. Now, I raise that because trust is defined as the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of an actor that cannot be directly controlled by you. That could be an individual, it could be an organization, it could be the public health establishment, it could be an AI actor. And I raise that because it's about the perceptions of these three things, not necessarily the reality. So I'd ask right now, how many people are right now confident that the US and other countries around the world perceive public health as having these three factors? Oh dear. For those that are joining us virtually, nobody in the room except myself raised their hand, and I only raised it to show that it's possible. This shows we have work to do in public health to overcome what are perceptions of benevolence, competence, and integrity. And again, we may have that. In fact, I think we do. I've met plenty of people who are doing public health that have those three factors. The trouble is we're being impacted by the perceptions thereof, and we've got to figure that out. Now, again, I tell people AI has been around for at least 70 years, and we shouldn't really be calling it artificial intelligence. We should be calling it alien interactions. That's what AI means, because these things do not think at all like us. Science says that it's about 15 to 20 watts in terms of everything we do with our brains. At the same time, you just saw Microsoft is thinking about turning on 3 Mile Island to power their AI, which is 3 to 5 kilowatts to power their AI. These AI systems are not at all thinking like we are. They are using what's right now called deep learning, which is kind of brute force, trying to understand the world and doing basically sophisticated pattern matching. It is not really intelligent. It's not really gleaning insights about the world. It is just doing very fancy pattern matching, whether it's to text or image or video prompts. And at the same time, we all know these are not fact-finding machines. They are just really good at doing pattern matching. But I raise that because it is still an impact that we need to think about with public health. Generative AI is going to be there whether we like it or not. Generative AI is going to result in the next 3 to 6 to 9 to 12 months apps of dubious quality claiming they can give health recommendations to people. Does public health have a response to that? Are you ready when someone says, well, my app said this is the right path, and you as a public health professional kind of believe that that's not the right approach? How do you dissuade someone that their app is wrong and you are right? This is going to be challenging. As already mentioned as well, the current approaches are massively data intensive as well as processing intensive, and as a result, energy intensive. None of us would spend 1 million attempts with a 3 or 4-year-old saying, here's how you draw the letter A. But that is what we're doing essentially with AI. Instead, we would show them how to draw the letter of A. We'd ask them to draw it. We'd say, you got this part right, this part wrong, and try again. But that's not what we're doing with the current version of AI. How many of you remember this thing called Napster? I realize I'm dating myself as a Gen Xer, but if you weren't familiar with Napster, it was in the 1990s. It was kind of dubious in how it respected or did not respect, it didn't respect, IP rights of artists. We are having a Napster-like moment all over again when it comes to AI. It's unclear where the data came from. It's unclear if any equity was actually given to the actual AI, the people that contributed to the AI. And then on top of it, because we're using deep learning does not work if the present or future is different than the past. So what happened in 2020 that was completely different than what the last 5 or 6 years had shown in health? Oh, come on now. You all know. Someone volunteer. What happened in 2020 that was different than the last 5 or 6 years? COVID, exactly. And guess what broke? Several existing AI models that were not as public because it hadn't caught the imagination of the world, those models broke because they didn't work in a COVID world. So for public health, we cannot necessarily use generative AI to predict the future. It will fail the moment the world changes. But we can advance other methods, and we can ask for it, one of which is active inference, which I'm happy to discuss on the side if anyone has any questions. But we need to push for better methods, because anyone who tells you they can use generative AI for public health to predict the future is probably selling you something. Second trend. So on the left-hand side for all of you, those are the top 10 companies in the world in terms of their market cap. All of them are data intensive. And then on the right-hand side are the top 10 countries in the world in terms of GDP. So back in 2017, before COVID, those top 10 companies, if you pulled together their market cap was larger than all the GDPs of all the world's nations combined except for the top 4. And that was before COVID. As we know what happened with COVID, several countries' economies either stalled or went negative. And at the same time, these companies that were data intensive and AI intensive, they saw their stocks either double or triple. It is quite possible in the next 5 years, we will be in a world in which there are 10 companies whose market cap is larger than all the world's countries combined, except for the United States and China. How do we do public health in that world? At the same time, it's not like all orgs are really getting things great. I recognize we're public health, but cybersecurity does impact us. How many people think we're winning in terms of cybersecurity? All right, nobody's raising their hands to that as well. At the same time, I would submit it's not just about cybersecurity. the big takeaway that I really want to leave you with is I want to submit that data is a form of voice for people. Let me put that in perspective. Back in 2020, if you remember, the United States, once we started getting a handle on COVID, we started rolling out testing dollars for the state governments to set up testing facilities for COVID. The states did what was probably the reasonable thing in their mind, which is they put the testing facilities where people lived. Unfortunately, in the United States, especially in the southeastern United States, if you are Black or Hispanic, you are more likely to have a longer commute to work, 30 to 45 minutes on average. That's unfortunate, but that's the reality. And so when they rolled out the testing sites where people lived, and they had them open from 9 to 5 on weekdays, guess what they found? They immediately resulted in saying hesitancy in minority groups to get tested for COVID. Do you think that was the case? Or did they put the testing sites in the wrong place? And had that data been looked at, and ultimately they did, and I was one of the few people that said, wait a minute, let's look at the data, they quickly realized they should put the testing sites where people work, not where people live. And the moment they did that, they saw no hesitancy whatsoever. But that's how data can speak for a population. Because fast forward a year later, if you remember when they came out with the actual vaccines for COVID, they initially said you had to be above a certain age. I can't remember if it was 60 or 59 and a half, but you had to be a certain age because of the limitations. And major newspapers in our country, including New York Times, came out and said hesitancy for certain minority groups to get the COVID vaccine. And again, basic data literacy 101, sadly in the United States, for historically unjust reasons as well as other factors, if you're over the age of 60, you're more likely to be Caucasian. And so those newspapers that we're looking at and seeing more Caucasians versus others getting the COVID vaccine miss the fact that the baseline, which as we all know from Epidemiology 101 is important, is itself skewed. And so the moment they removed the age barrier, they quickly saw that there was no hesitancy. If anything, they saw more for those groups, more of a willingness to actually get tested and get the vaccine for COVID. So I raise that because we are in a world in which, one, we need to encourage more data literacy 101 for Congress, just saying, and two, that speaks for where things are or aren't done on policy. Back in the mid-2010s, this meme of data is the new oil, I don't know how it survived past the first 5 minutes. Oil, use it up, it's gone. Data, use it, it's still there. Even more interesting, if you involve the very people associated with the data, the very community, they'll spot errors. They'll refine the data, they'll improve the data, they'll add to it, they'll create metadata. And so this idea that we need to hoard data, which several large companies, including the 10 that I just showed you a little bit earlier, they believe you should hoard data. I would submit that's completely the wrong approach. Not to mention, we can't do that in public health. If we hoard data, are they going to trust us? If we hoard data, is that now an attack surface because they're going to say, well, you don't know what they're doing with your data, you don't know what they're doing behind the curtain. Much less, if we do this as a venture with a private sector company, how does that private sector company explain to their shareholders that they're not monetizing the data? Especially because we live in a world where if you're a public company, your shareholders can sue you as CEO if you don't do actions to maximize their return on investment. So literally, if a CEO says, I don't want to sell the data, I don't want to monetize the data, and they're publicly traded, that CEO is facing a lawsuit. So we've got to figure out new ways to do this, especially in free societies. Now, we already mentioned a little bit, we're not exactly winning when it comes to cybersecurity, but let's put that more in perspective. In 2019, it was estimated there was about $11 billion in global damages as a result of ransomware attacks. Several of them actually beginning to hit hospitals. They actually began to hit more hospitals as the years went on. 2020, they went from 11 billion to 20 billion. 2021, they went from 20 billion to 43 billion. And then they stopped counting because it got so depressing. Now, if we also look at the average payout, in 2019, the average payout to a ransomware attacker was a little bit less than $9,000. Then we went up to about $80,000 a year later. And then we're now at about $230,000. Why are the payoffs going higher for the same ransomware attacks? Anybody know? What were we doing in the same backdrop as all this? We rolled out cybersecurity insurance. And what happens when you roll out cybersecurity insurance? What can the attackers ask for now? More money. Whoops. Probably should have thought that one through. And why are they attacking hospitals? Because they have cybersecurity insurance, and so they can pay more. That's partly it. Partly, as I will also show you, health data is incredibly valuable, especially in a generative AI era. I have seen where you can take existing health data and 10 minutes of compute time using a thing called Worm GPT. Worm GPT is the dark side cousin of ChatGPT, plus some plugins, and say, generate for me 1 million realistic looking health records, complete with checks, x-rays, and prescription notes for Medicare claims below $250. And in about 10 minutes, you'll get those million records. Now, below $250, why am I asking that? Because that's below the threshold in which Medicare spends the time to adjudicate whether this is fraud or not, because it's going to cost more to adjudicate whether it's fraud or not than to pay it out. And if I wait until November or December to submit those realistic looking health records, is anyone going to notice, given flu, RSV, and COVID, that we've had a little blip in the uptake in Medicare claims? So we've got to get ready for the fact that generative AI is going to use health and public health data to do a whole lot of financial fraud. At the same time, that's exactly what generative AI is designed to do. It's meant to be very good at looking human-like. And it's really good at spreading things that look human. Unfortunately, they're not just targeting the health communities, they're increasingly targeting teenagers because they think they can blackmail teenagers with things that are not real, or things that are sort of real but taken out of context, or things that they just are like, you do not want your parents to know about this, and they begin to extort them. This is increasingly a problem for all of society, and it's getting worse. I was playing during a break. I won't spend too much time, but the voices you are about to hear in less than 4 minutes, I uploaded an article I wrote in 2030, and it created a very NPR sounding like podcast in 4 minutes. So this is not real in the sense that it took a realistic article. It was actually spot on in the accuracy, but it was not a human voice. We are now at the point, instead of doing tests for whether you are a bot or not, we probably are going to start doing online tests to say, are you actually the human you claim to be? And again, think about what does this mean for public health? How do you know that the data you are collecting about the community actually is about the community? During COVID as well, for reasons we do not know, I'm part of a group that tracks how online things could be messed with. We saw that if you were of a minority group and you typed in the terms COVID vaccine and Google thought you were one in the United States and Google thought that you were with a minority group, you were much more likely to get delivered in the top 10 search results, multiple links referring you to the Sputnik vaccine by Russia. And why was that the case? It was because people bought keywords to squat on. Now, we don't know if those were actors domestic or foreign. We don't know exactly what their intent was other than that's not good. But how many of us are tracking what keywords are being bought when it comes to public health by different private actors or other nation states? How many of us, when we do a public health venture, go intentionally to figure out the keywords that are going to be used so that we make sure there's better information versus worse information? How many of you go past the second page of search results even? Just saying. So this is the world we're in. Now, what do these massive changes mean? I'm going to first pause before I ask what this is and say, do any of you have any questions? Because you all have been way too quiet. How many of you are feeling optimistic about the future? Pessimistic? Undetermined? You're allowed to have all 3 states. All right, so 1969. What happened in 1969? What is this a picture of all 4 nodes of? This is the ARPANET. This is the early predecessor to the internet. It was run by the Department of Defense. Fast forward to 1982, the United States is beginning to get connected. 1993, this is still pre-World Wide Web. Does anybody remember Netscape Navigator or Mosaic browser? I do too. Proud user. Go for an Archie protocols. The world is beginning to get connected, but it's still pretty much a Europe and US phenomenon. 2007, These are broadband connections making up the internet. They gave up trying to draw borders of countries on the map. 2007 was also an interesting year because that's showing you landline broadband connections, but it was the same year there was actually as many, if not more, mobile broadband connections as there were fixed ones. So that could easily be doubled. We just don't know where to draw the mobile broadband connections. Fast forward to 2013. This is the internet as we know it. They gave up even trying to draw it on a map, and that was the last time they tried drawing it up on a map. 2013 was also an interesting year because that was the year where we had 7.1 billion human beings and 7.1 billion network devices on the planet. Fast forward 11 years later, we are now in a world in which there's about 8.1, 8.2 human beings and anywhere between 45 and 55 billion network devices. We are the minority. 2013 was also the year where there was more machine-to-machine, aka bot traffic, than there was human traffic. That was 2013, 10 years ago. So we are living in a completely different era than public health is used to operating in. I would also submit that most of the methods that we use for public health were designed for an era in which data was scarce. How many of you feel like data is scarce anymore? Now, good data might be scarce, and being able to glean insights from the data might be scarce. But if anything, we are flooded by data. It's also worth noting that ChatGPT 3.5 is probably the last time we can say an AI was trained on data that was not produced by other AIs. All the AIs going forward are being trained on both real data and synthetic data. And increasingly, the amount of data on the planet that's going to be produced, we're going to be doubling the amount of data on the planet every 2 years or so, is increasingly going to be synthetic and fake. This is going to impact public health dramatically. Because how are you going to know if what you're using is reliable or not, accurate or not, actually representative of the community you're trying to help or not? So let's go back to the question of trust. Again, remember, it's about the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of an actor you cannot directly control. The question I would ask is this something that actually exists in society? Are you willing to trust companies? Do you perceive benevolence? Do you perceive competence? Do you perceive integrity? Are you willing to trust governments? Do you perceive benevolence? Do you perceive competence? Do you perceive integrity? Maybe the questions we're asking of AI are actually proxies for questions about society. We're just using AI as a scapegoat. Now, at the same time, in 2017, Pew Research found for those under the age of 25 in the United States, less than 45% perceived capitalism as good, and less than 20% thought it was wrong to throw a coup if the government was perceived as incompetent. Now, that's not just a US phenomenon. We're seeing it in Sweden, we're seeing it in Australia, we're seeing it in the Netherlands, we're seeing it in New Zealand. It seems the further we get away from World War II, all the norms are up for grabs as to what's right and what's wrong. At the same time, as we understand in public health, we are products of biology. Not intentional biology. Evolution is a blind watchmaker. But all these biases we have, ranging from confirmation bias, where once we believe an idea, we're going to lock into it, to sunk cost bias, tribalism, my side bias. These are all things that at some point in time in human history were actually evolutionary advantages for those who had them. We are biased individuals as a result of evolution. And so we go into this world in which AI is either going to amplify our strengths or amplify our weaknesses. At the same time, we are really good at anthropomorphizing anything. We've done it for the last 3,000 plus years. We see human-like entities in clouds. We see human-like entities in stones. Children do it with animals. We refer to machines or cars as having a he or she gender. And we're doing it with AI as well. There was a study that was done back in the 1980s where they actually played what's called the bargaining game. The bargaining game is where I give you a choice of this entity has $20. They're going to offer you some percentage of it. You can choose to accept or reject it. Now, what would an economist say is the rational amount to accept if someone offers you a percentage of those $20? Anyone know? An economist would say it's rational to accept 1 penny. because having 1 penny, even if the other person gets $19.99, is better than having nothing. Now, what do we in public health know human beings will do? We'll turn it down. We're irrational. And we'll go for about 30 or 40%. We can influence it by what we say, if it's a teacher-student relationship or other things like that. Nouns matter. But we humans are actually irrational when it comes to the bargaining game, at least in terms of what economists consider to be rational. So they said they were going to play a game where the computer was pre-programmed to make pre-programmed offers to you. They were set in stone. And we're going to give you an envelope at the end so you can see what the computer's doing. At what point in time is the rational thing to do when the computer's already pre-programmed to make offers to you? Accept everything. Because the computer's not going to change its mind. Guess what humans did, including economists did? They punished the machine for unfair offers. Was that rational? No. But we're going to be doing the same thing with AI. And it's going to create a lot of problems. We're going to think it's thinking like us when in fact it's not doing anything like that. Again, AI is alien interactions. And also remember the original Turing test. The original Turing test was the idea that a machine was trying to deceive you to think that it was human. That's what data scientists and AI experts have been trying to build. A machine that will deceive you as being human. Is that the right test? Maybe instead of trying to deceive you whether it's human or not, we need to actually figure out how it can uplift the strengths of individuals, of groups, of communities, and then mitigate the weaknesses. But that's not something that's in the mindset of what AI and data scientists have been pursuing. So let's go back and consider, let's think about ChatGPT. Does anyone think there's any way we can determine whether or not it's benevolent or not? All right, everyone's looking like, I don't know if I can figure out the benevolence of a ChatGPT. Okay, what about competence? Well, again, large language models are not fact-checking. They're pattern matching. And so they will hallucinate. And hallucinate is just what happens when you ask it a question it doesn't have any pattern for. And so it creates a synthetic pattern. That's why when you ask ChatGPT about an article in Science or Nature or whatever journal, it will actually create realistic-looking references that are completely fake. Because it's matching on your prompt, can't find any data that matches it, so it creates the best approximation. And in terms of integrity, well, how many of you have ever told a ChatGPT that's not right, and it says, my apologies, and it goes in whatever direction you steered it, and then you say, that's not right either, and it goes in a different direction too. So it doesn't have benevolence, or at least we can't figure that out, definitely doesn't have competence, and does not have integrity. At the same time, think about all the obscured boxes that we have in society. Boardrooms, governments, militaries, companies. How do we know if they're acting benevolently? How do we know if they're operating with competence and integrity as well? So, now that I've laid the landscape, I'm going to give you 5 practical things we can do in public health. I was actually part of a group that sponsored an open source competition in Topcoder. Topcoder is a place where you can download open source software for free. This actually exists. We took a Veterans Affairs form, and we wanted to see if anybody could write code that would translate a government form into a conversation that you could have through text or verbally to fill out the form. We were successful. So this code exists. You can use it now. And I would submit that for public health, we need to stop doing forms and start doing conversations that help fill out the data we need. Why do people need to know what Veterans Affairs form? Why do they need to know what public health form they need to download? Can it actually be a conversation? The machine asks questions, and at the very end it says, here's what I've recorded from you. Is this accurate? You say yes, and it submits the information for you in a form nature, but it's been collected through a conversation. Second, well, I was also part of a group that was trying to figure out why veterans were not applying for benefits. And so we first did the quantitative, and we saw that when veterans became eligible for benefits, military veterans, they would go online, they would fill out the forms up to the very point where they had to sign, and then they'd stop. More than 90% would not complete it after filling everything else out. So we had to switch to qualitative and ask why. And what we found was many of them said, I don't know where the data is going. I don't know what's going to be done with it. Is this going to have other negative impacts for me or my family? Now, it's worth noting that a lot of veterans have PTSD, and one of the major symptoms of PTSD is paranoia. And so that shouldn't have been a surprising finding, but it was. And the intervention, the solution was to have a chatbot that was trained on questions as well as answers provided by and given by veterans. And the chatbot would pop up and say, "Hi, I've been trained on questions as well as answers shared with veterans like yourself. Can I help answer any questions you have?" And so they could ask and say, "What's going to be done with my data? Where's it going to go? Like, why is this form being collected?" That sort of thing. And it resulted in more than 90% completion rate. Now, that was a bot. It was a bot identifying itself as a bot, but it actually helped people cross the threshold. Later, and I'll show this a little bit later, I was also part of a group, this has actually been published in Science and Nature, where they took people that we reasonably believe in, we believe they believe conspiracy theories. In other words, I'm saying we don't think there was a shooter on the grassy knoll, so if you think there was a second shooter on the grassy knoll, you're probably believing conspiracy theory. That group was given 20 minutes to interact with the chatbot to talk about their conspiracy theories. And the chatbot just listened. And they talked through their logic, they talked about their reasoning. The chatbot might respond every once in a while with other ideas, but it wasn't actively trying to dissuade them. It was just trying to listen to them and think through their thought process. After 20 minutes, more than 20% said they were less likely to believe their conspiracy theory, which I would not have predicted. I thought it was going to go in the other direction. And what it may be showing is we humans are storytellers. I mean, everything I've been doing in this talk has been stories to you. The trouble is in public health, how do we collect data? Do we collect data as a story? Now think about what physicians do. When you ask a physician about when they saw a patient, do they rattle off the numbers and stats? No, they tell you the story. The person came in, presented with these signs and symptoms, we asked these questions, we did these interventions. And so medicine has been doing it. It's only public health that has been treating data as if it's numbers and stats, when in fact maybe it's about the story and then extracting from it the relevant numbers we need. And so I raise that because this is a way that communities can have voices. Not to go too much into this, other than to say that there are other examples already happening with urban housing, with actual trying to do justice in terms of helping people get access to services, where cloud-based decision support can remove the biases we humans have. Sadly, we know that if you apply online and you have a non-Western name, unfortunately in the United States, you are 3 times less likely to be hired than if you have a Western name. That's wrong. But there's a very simple fix, which is basically just make sure the name is not shown to either the human or the machine. There's other things like that as well. But I raise that. Yes, go ahead. So the short answer is, yeah, I was of the opinion you must identify yourself as a bot. To not identify yourself as a bot is deception. The second thing is, it's actually the perceived empathy, humans, we do it to ourselves. I mean, we do it, I mean, how many kids have their stuffed animals that they love and carry around? You know, it doesn't take much for us to have perceived entity in a non-human object. And what I would submit is what's probably happening is the chatbot is just listening. And it's allowing the human to get their thoughts out. And when they get their thoughts out, then a reframing happens. Not to get too geeky, I'm a student of what's called James G. March. He was a professor at Stanford, and he believes that identity is actually a continuous process of re-updating who you are based on your actions and then how you reframe those actions. And that you do new actions, you reframe them, you do new actions, you reframe them, and your identity changes. And so what's probably happening is as they talk to the bot, it might be perceived entity, but I actually think it's just identity reframing. So the very process of having conversation, in this case, with an inanimate object. And there is precedent for this. The Catholic Church has been having confessionals for 2,000 plus years where the priest is listening. Is the priest empathetic? I don't know. You don't see their face, but they're listening. Other questions? That was a good one. Yes? Yes. Yeah, it's a fear that in some respects they can ask questions that are like, you're a bot, it doesn't matter. What are you going to do? It's like, it's like I can talk to you and I know that it's not going to go anywhere. But that's obviously where we need to be very cautious, because if it was a for-profit company, I can guarantee you they will be monetizing that data for some purpose. I'm part of an effort called Burst to 3 as a volunteer. And what we're trying to do is make sure every infant between the ages of when they're born to the ages of 3 and hopefully afterwards in the United States gets the necessary physical, mental, and emotional care that they deserve. Now, one of the biggest barriers right now is those people that are caregivers to infants are usually working 1, if not 2 jobs. They might be single parents. So to ask them to then go to a government place to wait in line to fill out a form is kind of crazy. And so what we wanted to see is, could you have text-based conversations through a flip phone? So you don't even need to have a smartphone, just basically SMS texting to say, I'm looking for resources to help my child with the following thing. Could we later move that to as actually voice as well and say, how can I get benefits for my child? How can I help find services to help with childcare? Or even just basic questions like, what are the top 10 lullabies I should be playing to my child? Or what are the top reading materials that are age appropriate for my child? Because unfortunately, guess where the #1 source is right now that caregivers for infants are going for the top 10 lullabies? Almost TikTok. How many people feel good about that? Yeah. What could go wrong? So I raise that, and also just recognize again, there's a whole industry, a whole for-profit industry that is trying to figure out if you are pregnant or not. We all know the story of where Target was able to identify someone was pregnant before she was able to tell her father that she was pregnant. There's a whole industry, because that's a major life change. There are things that can be sold to you. You're a marketing, and so that's why we intentionally chose for it to be a nonprofit, and intentionally also put as oversight both the people providing care as well as the caregivers themselves, representatives, to make sure that we have regular audits, that at no point in time is the data ever monetized, because that's very sensitive data. Other examples, again, this is more in the physical space, but we can think about the same thing. You can use computer vision, which is different than generative AI. If any of you have ever worked with Rita Caldwell, I got to work with her when I was at the CDC back in the 2000s. You can pick up signs of cholera from space, cholera here on Earth. And what are you looking for? You're basically looking for the spectral signature that says, yep, something's in the water. You can actually detect that from space. In a past life, what I did at the CDC, I signed up it was November of 2000 for a little known program called the Bioterrorism Preparedness Response Program. We were only 30 people. Every 6 months or so, Congress said we didn't need to exist. We said there might be reasons. And if you remember, in February of 2001, the Agile Manifesto came out. And what was the Agile Manifesto? It said that basically, instead of doing waterfall development, where you try to collect all your requirements up front and then eventually build it as one straight shot, you do iterative development. And so I was a big fan of it. And I was being told at the powers that be by the CDC at the time, they said, nope, you're being disruptive. You need to do the 5-year enterprise architecture, the 3-year budgeting cycle. And I'm literally on record in June of 2001 saying, we don't have a deal with the terrorists not to strike until we have our IT systems online. I was not popular. But anyway, so fast forward, it was scheduled weeks in advance for me to give a briefing to the FBI and the CIA as to what we would do technology-wise should a bioterrorism event happen. That briefing just happened to be scheduled for September 11th, 2001 at 9 o'clock in the morning. Incidentally, that's also when I was supposed to have my first class with biostatistics at Rollins School of Public Health was that afternoon. And I had to email Vicki Hertzberg, Professor Vicki Hertzberg, and say, I'm sorry, I won't be able to attend class today. We're busy responding to a bioterrorism event. But I raised that because had we not pushed for agile development, if we had done the waterfall approach, we would have not had any hope of what came later, because we stood down from High Alert on October 1st. October 3rd, I flew and briefed the CIA. Got back to CDC on October 4th, and the first case of anthrax shows up in Florida. A few days later, shows up in New York and DC. We ended up with 3 million environmental samples and 300,000 clinical samples that, had we not done agile development, would have been handled by fax. Instead, we were able to do them electronically. Sometimes you have to step outside of expectations, and you have to be willing to take flack to try and do the right thing. But let's fast forward. So then the other thing we found out, this was late 2002, we began to suspect that there was what we were calling atypical febrile illness in Southeast Asia. And what do I mean by that? Well, we saw two signs. One, the price of garlic had gone up tenfold. Garlic in Southeast Asia is seen as a cure-all, so if you see a price spike, that could be a sign of something. But the other thing we saw, again, we weren't tracking individual people. We didn't have that technology. We weren't trying to do that. Bless you, by the way. So in late 2002, we saw more cars, the reflectivity of windows of cars in parking lots around hospitals, and less reflectivity of cars around factories. So these two things caused us to ask the State Department, to ask the Chinese government if anything's going on. Chinese government each time said no. We asked once in January. We asked again in February. And I get it, especially in China, national security and public health are intertwined. So I kind of understand why they said no. But it was a week before St. Patrick's Day 2003. I was getting ready to go home at 6 o'clock, and they said, nope. We've got a case of atypical febrile illness in Vietnam. They want assistance. And it turned out, of course, later that was SARS, the original coronavirus, severe acute respiratory syndrome. But in 2002, 2003, we could see that using non-obvious economic signals and non-obvious signals from space. Fast forward to what happened with COVID-19. Guess what happened in October of 2019? Price of garlic went up dramatically. And not through government satellites. This time it was through commercial satellites. We saw the same thing. So we can very easily put out an early alert system that doesn't rely on governments to tell other governments what's going on. But again, we've got to think about how we do so using computer vision and other approaches to be smarter about this. This is the article that I was mentioning, Durability Reducing Conspiracy Theories Using AI. It was published both in Science and Nature. There have been others that have replicated this experiment, so it does have replicability. MIT has done it as well. But it's available, and also we'll make sure all the slides are available to folks as well. So, in closing, don't let the fear of missing out cause you to rush headlong into generative AI. While I have shown you that AI is there and there are things we can do, it can also do a whole lot of bad things too. What I'm trying to say, though, is we've got to figure out our strategy. We've got to be aware it's there, because I guarantee you, whether it's Elon Musk or someone else, is going to come up with a health app claiming that this health app can give you all you need to know about how to manage your health. And so we've got to figure out what our strategy is. Also be ready, and this is more for clinicians, but it may also happen to public health professionals. What happens if someone brings their phone and says, I want to turn my microphone on? It wants to listen to what you're talking about and what you're advising me on. What's our response? What's the doctor's response when a patient says, I want to record our conversation? What's the doctor's response when the insurance company wants to record their conversation? By the way, the #1 use for generative AI right now for medical doctors, anyone know what that is? They either dictate or type 4 to 5 short bullets about the patient they just saw, and then they tell the generative AI to create 2 to 3 pages, and they cut and paste that into your medical file. Now, there is a risk there, because if you put that in someone's medical file, 1, you hope it's right, might not be, but then 2, if an AI reads in something that was produced by that same AI, there's a thing called model destabilization, I know it's jargony, or AI self-cannibalization, more sensationalistic. But basically it means that if an AI reads in something that itself produced, it starts over-regressing to the mean, and it gets destabilized. Right now, AI companies are not labeling when they put someone in someone's medical record which AI it came from. So they are possibly destabilizing their own models as a result of this. Get ready for the lawsuits in 3 to 5 years. The other thing is that we got to think about improving our security. We're not winning at cybersecurity. This data is important and useful for us, but unfortunately also for fraudsters. This includes voice. This includes data as a voice. And you have to start thinking about when you're going to actually be dealing with this and avoiding it. The last thing, and I'm going to show you the example, is get ready for a wave of AI-generated fraud. Again, this is going to hit more the healthcare space. But given how public health interacts with the healthcare space, it's going to have splash damage on us. And it's going to raise interesting questions as well. Nope, it actually doesn't show you the record. But it's actually available there where, again, 10 minutes of compute time using Worm GPT, you can create 1 million realistic records. So how do we go forward from this? Start with either the community or the business need and build around that. Don't rush to the technology. Say, what is a community or business need that I cannot solve? And how will I move forward from there? Second, You've got to figure out how you put people in charge of this. It's got to be human governance. And I'm not a big fan of AI ethics, and I'll tell you why. I mean, I'm all about being ethical, that's great. But remember, there were things in the 1700s and the 1800s we thought were ethical that we do not think are ethical now. And so we may spend a whole lot of time talking about AI ethics only to have that change 10 to 20 years from now. Back in World War I, the British government thought that submarines were unethical because they went underneath the water, but that it was perfectly ethical to take a military boat and disguise it as a civilian boat. These were called Q-boats. Fast forward to World War II, after the Lusitania was sunk, they realized, oh, probably not ethical to have military boats disguised as civilian boats. At the same time, given the pressures they were facing, it became perfectly ethical to do submarines. And so as much as I appreciate people talking about AI ethics, recognize ethics are socially defined, not morals, which are more internal compass. And so what we really should be talking about is how do we govern these and what are the guardrails we need to put on? Think about data and intellectual property rights. Think about how we involve people. There's a paper that's actually available there with MIT that I wrote in 2019, trying to think about how you do this in a principled way. And as final thoughts, I'll end on an optimistic note. This was a photo taken in 2013 when NASA's probe Cassini passed Saturn and turned around. But in 1994, Carl Sagan said, look again at that dot. That's here. That's home. That's us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, every human being you ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only place we've ever known. I encourage you to be bold, to be brave, and most importantly, be benevolent, and thank you for your time. All right, you all have been way too quiet, so please bring the hard questions. Yes, yep, so two things I think need to happen. And I'll repeat the question for those who are not able to hear it. The question was, probably we can't avoid AI. It's here. You can't put it back in the box. What would I recommend to companies, maybe governments as well, as to how we move forward and do so in a rational way? Is that fair? Okay. So two things. One, obviously we have a big event happening in the United States in November. We'll see how that goes. And after that, we probably need to encourage the federal government to fund the state governments to create safe spaces to figure out how to do AI in health. And those need to be at universities. I'm not just saying that because I'm at Emory. But believe it or not, actually, guess what? Trust in universities is about 50%, whereas trust in government is about 22%, just saying. Universities, operational nonprofits, and I'm using the word operational nonprofits because there's plenty of non-operational nonprofits that are really good at writing papers, and that's all they do. We really need to actually figure out places to do this and put in place bipartisan oversight boards. That won't protect you from a foreign disinformation attack, but it at least reduce the likelihood of a domestic one. And say, experiment at the local level within your state about how we use AI in healthcare responsibly in these settings. And then for the private sector companies, this is a chance to test your technology, to field your technology, but no, you're not getting the data. You can show the outcomes, you can show the results, but you're not getting the data because it's so important. The other thing that I think can also be made, and this is what we're trying to do with Birth to Three, so in the housing space, the number one loss of money for landlords at the moment is the fact that somebody gets sick, they can no longer make payments on their rent, they fall behind, and then after 6 or 9 months, you have to evict them. Interesting enough, the argument we're making, and it's been shown, if you can provide internet for free to that house, plus the ability to do a medical consult with a doctor by video, they are less likely to get severely sick. They may still get sick, but not severely sick. They're most likely to get treatment, not fall behind on their payments, still be able to work, and you don't have to evict them. And so we're arguing that you have a choice. You can do nothing, and you're going to lose more money because of the evictions you have to do. Or if you provide free internet and free medical consults by video, that actually will reduce the risk of eviction and also make the person more healthy as a result. And so we're trying to show data-based evidence that actually says, yes, it's a commercial solution, but it's a way of actually reducing the losses you're making in the commercial sector for what you're doing. That's harder, but I think that's what we're going to have to do, because short of us fundamentally changing how the United States operates, which it's not going to happen anytime soon, we've got to figure out how to make the compelling case both to governments as well as the private sector. Does that help? Okay. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So the question that was asked, just for folks, especially folks who are virtual, is there a thing that AI in particular generative AI is doing right now that will make a certain part of public health redundant? Data collection. In the sense that we've got to fundamentally change how we do data collection. Right now, we design lots of forms. I think that's the wrong way to do it. It's got to be conversational. And through the conversations, then we pull things from that. But beyond that, I think it's really just about upgrading what we're already doing. If you're in environmental and occupational health, how do you use computer vision to do faster analyses? If you're in hospital management, how do you actually quickly audit and assess where there's actually opportunities for efficiencies and things like that? So it really is more about upgrading public health to work with it and augment it as opposed to replace it. But if there is one thing I'd replace, it's data collection using forms. Now, it's worth knowing in the 1970s, guess how they did cohort studies in the 1970s? They would fill out the form and they would punch holes, you know, whether you're male, you're female, race, everything like that. And then they would straighten a coat hanger and they would run it through the forms. And if you went through the holes, that was your cohort. Now, in a past life, when severe acute respiratory syndrome was happening, followed by monkeypox, I literally had folks at the CDC changing the forms they were collecting on every 6 hours. Free text, multiple choice, pick one, pick many. Well, if you constantly are changing how you collect data, it's really hard to do your cohort study. But I raise that because, again, just like in the 1970s where we used coat hangers and we moved to databases, I think we now need to move to databases to chatbots, and the chatbots help collect our data. Other questions?
In one of your solutions, you talked about like data cooperatives, like entities like pooling data together, but I just like, can't really see like private companies like doing that.
Oh, it won't be private companies. In fact, if anything, they'll tell you don't do it. So data cooperatives, for those who are not familiar with them, data trusts, they're called data trusts in the UK. We call them data cooperatives in the US. Same thing, just different terms. What it means is a group of people come together and say, we're all artists, we're all musicians, we're all people that care about Parkinson's research. We use existing contract law, so you don't even have to wait for government to do anything, to form a cooperative and say, we will make our collective data available via contract with these different companies for the following purposes. And the nice thing about that is you can actually say, for example, one, we only want our data to be used for Parkinson's research and nothing else. So you can actually narrow define, and you can say, I want financial remuneration. Maybe I don't. Maybe I just want you to find a treatment. Or maybe I don't want money up front, but any cure you find, some of the equity goes back to the community. But what's also more interesting is once you form that cooperative, you can actually then say, we don't want our data to leave us. Instead, we want your algorithm to come to our environment, learn on our data here, and then leave, but at no point in time has our data left our silo. And so it's a very effective measure, but I will tell you, yes, all the big companies are going to resist it until they can't. I'm trying to go to the companies that are right now either more privacy sensitive, Salesforce, Apple, or something like that, to say, wouldn't you want to do this as a marketing advantage over the companies that are not? Yes, one more question, go ahead.
Like going off of what you just said, so like in machine learning, we talk about like dividing data into like testing and training, or no,
yes,
training and testing data sets. So you're saying that these cooperatives should like kind of like hold on to like the training. Like
yeah.
Training
oh, do not let your data out. Once you let your data out, I cannot guarantee where it goes. Yes, but that's possible now. It's what's called federated algorithmic learning. Sorry, again, jargony, but it means instead of the algorithm learning in one massive place, it actually goes to where the data is on the edge and it never leaves it. And I would submit for us in public health, that has much more trust. All right, Michelle.
Okay, I know that it's 1 o'clock and you all probably have classes to get to. Can you all thank David for us?
Thank you.
I think David might have a few minutes to stick around and
I'll
answer any additional individual questions if you have the time. But again, thank you for being here. David, thank you so much for giving us your time today. And have a great afternoon, everyone.